So welcome everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to all the Courage to Be students, the folks taking one of the Courage to Be classes and the faculty teaching them. This is part of the Courage to Be lecture series, and so in Q&A we'll try and give precedence to the students in those classes, but we should have time to hope to get through to other people as well if there are other questions. The Courage to Be seminar and lecture series is, I think, now in its 6th year. It's been a really successful and wonderful effort. The idea is to bring a number of students from different classes and different backgrounds. They read a couple common texts and they see 3 common lectures during a semester. And it's an attempt to provide a kind of common conversation around big questions like what is moral, political, and ethical courage? What does it mean to live courageously in a world in which responsibility is often diffuse through bureaucracy and other ways that we just lose sight of our need to act courageously in public. For Hannah Arendt, the first virtue of politics was courage. It was the courage to leave the security of your private world and risk something in the public. And we have a number of Courage to Be student fellows who help run the program and who meet at the beginning of the year and select the speakers that we're going to invite. And it's always a great process to hear them talk about people who inspire them, who've acted courageously in their lives. And today we're going to have one of those speakers, and I'm going to introduce the student who suggested them. Her name is Sage Sakamano. She's an Arendt student fellow in the Courage to Be program, so it's great to be working with her this year. She's a freshman. We don't always have freshmen in the program, but it's great to have her. And she's a political science and biology major. She's also an activist who helped organize the Count Me In Global Summit in Toronto. And amongst other things was Miss Teen Rodeo in Sandpoint, Idaho. So welcome, Sage, and I'll turn this evening over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Roger, for the lovely introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining us here tonight on Zoom. I cannot thank you all enough. I am extremely excited to introduce to you all Professor Adolph L. Reed Jr. Adolph is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Over the years, he has written, edited, and collaborated on countless books and articles regarding the ideas of race, politics, and culture. Professor Reed was invited here and graciously accepted our invitation due to his incredible record of activism, academia, and courage, whether he may want to admit it or not. Currently, he is working on 2 new books, tentatively titled Reflections of the Jim Crow South, a non-memoir, and When Compromises Come Home to Roost, with the intent to be released in the beginning of 2022. When Compromises Come Home to Roost is the book project that was started in the beginning of the Obama administration, intending to focus on Obama mania and why people should have known better than to become extremely cult-like as we observed. But the book eventually took a turn to become an account of the decline and transformation of the left in the United States since the end of World War II. Without further ado, please join me in giving Professor Reed a warm welcome to our Bard community.
Hi, Sage. Thanks for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm still kind of bemused that you guys thought of me. I want to thank also Professor Berkowitz and everyone else who's responsible for inviting me. I'm very happy to be part of this event, and my experience with Bard students in the past tells me that it will be lively and engaging. Now, I should begin by noting that when Professor Berkowitz initially reached out to me, I was somewhat bemused as to why he and the rest of you guys would have thought I'd be a good person to talk about courage. It seems to me I should have asked Sage first about that, however, since she's the one who came up with it. That's because I haven't thought much in my life about courage, though I suppose I've thought more about lack of courage and what to make of that. So it struck me that the invitation would give me an occasion to think about courage and to think about what I think about courage. So I'm just going to say a little bit more about that. So I was a child during the McCarthy era in a period of anti-communist witch hunting, and I was in a left family. So I was aware from an early age of the phenomenon of people giving up or betraying friends and family members, not to speak of principals, to protect themselves from potential danger, either persecution or embarrassment. We were closer to the victims of betrayal than to the betrayers, and although I really haven't reflected much on it, I suspect that fact has had some impact on how I think of courage. Of course, I was also a child during the high period of activism in the civil rights movement, and for much of that time, we lived in the South. Not only did that provide occasion for casual observation of everyday courage. For instance, my parents were friendly with Elsie and Daisy Bates, publishers of the Black Little Rock newspaper and vocal activists in the state's NAACP leadership. And I recall driving to visit them during the 1957 Little Rock school desegregation crisis as a 10-year-old and having to lie down on the back seat of our car as we approached their home as a precaution against potential attackers, and having to check in with the security guards who protected the Bateses and their house around the clock. But none of that registered with me at the time as courage. It was life. But then I was a kid who didn't know any better. And living in the Jim Crow South during that period also made clear that there was a difference between courage and foolhardiness. But unfortunately, the experience didn't provide a clear sense of a line, much less a gray area between them. One had to improvise. And from my Catholic upbringing, that meant pretty constant examination of conscience, trying to discern whether my motives in given instances were reasonable or unacceptably self-serving. Knowledge of two of my father's dicta: one, that no one ever understands himself or herself to act from malign intentions, and two, that ideology is in one sense the mechanism that harmonizes the principles one wants to hold and what advances one's material interests, increase the degree of difficulty in the examination of conscience. It's just too easy to lie to oneself. Still, I never considered those dilemmas to be or to concern courage, but only the injunction to do the right thing and or to act as a decent person. Life also taught that it's a mistake, by definition, to expect people to respond heroically to extraordinary conditions. As historian Peter Novick argued in The Holocaust in American Life, asking why, for example, more ordinary Germans didn't do more to resist National Socialism is misguided and presumes or prejudges really a negative response. In crises, most people will try to protect themselves and those for whom they feel responsible. They will try to construct a normal life, and they will also act in solidarity with others toward those ends. Those impulses apply to life under oppressive regimes as well as to the aftermath of natural disasters. That's actually one of the sub-themes that I wanted to explore and communicate in my forthcoming non-memoir on the Jim Crow South, that in some ways Southern whites were as trapped by and in that regime as were Blacks. And there too, like the standard of courage as open opposition or as a willingness to express open opposition to an unjust order is not a reasonable standard to hold people to. But I'd like to shift gears and say a couple other general things about courage, or my experience with it anyway. Often I suspect when we wonder about the extent or resolve of our courage, our imaginations go to wondering what we do, how we act in situations in which the potential consequences of our action or inaction could be grave, even life or death. I'm sure we all hope that we do the right thing, right? There was a cartoon that went around office copy machines all over America in the late 1970s that depicted a little cartoon mouse from behind, standing on its hind legs, flipping the bird at an eagle, whose talons were about to pounce on the mouse. That image, from one perspective, is dying with dignity. From another, a feeble gesture of desperation. Without hyperbole, I can say that the couple of times I've found myself, with no intention of my own to be sure, suddenly in near-death circumstances, I learned that I had no cognized emotions at all. I didn't feel brave, I didn't feel fear, regret, or anything else. In fact, my experience was that everything, every sense, was in the moment. It was only after the fact that I felt any sort of emotion, and at that point, it was no longer time to feel anything like courage or cowardice. So I'm finally getting to my point here, which is, the way of the world of academics, as I know everyone knows. But the notion of courage as a collective project. I don't know how many people in attendance were able to watch the film, The Organizer. I think it's an extraordinary movie, and we'll say a couple things about it. It's set in late 19th century ex-urban Turin, Italy, in the textile industry, in textile towns, right? Like in a textile town in a textile region. So in that sense, it's not unlike the textile regions of the Piedmont American South a generation later. And the mill owner is, in fact, it's family-owned mill. This is before the large corporation. And the workers are poorly treated, poorly paid. They have no health and safety protection or anything like that. And so a group of the mill workers, get together and talking among themselves, they deputize, as it were, one of their ranks, a kind of blustery guy, to go and plead their case to make their demands of the mill owner. He does, he's fired. And no one backs him up, right? He was courageous, one might say. He was foolhardy, one could say, like he didn't know any better. But what happens then is that an itinerant socialist educator, teacher, comes into town on the back of a freight train and begins doing adult literacy classes for the mine workers. But he's also an organizer. And they develop a committee, and they learn how to act collectively. And with a collective action, they are able to organize a more or less successful strike. Now, the more or less is important here, right? Because they assert their grievances, they assert themselves, they show their collective power, right? And they're acting courageously, right, as a collective. And their courage comes partly from the sense of their shared collective power. But like an interesting kind of aside about it, that is a couple of years ago, I watched a glut of comparable movies that came out in the greater 60s. The Organizer, the classic film of the Algerian Revolution, the Battle of Algiers, a film called Z, which was an examination of the lead up to the colonel's coup in Greece in the late 1960s, and State of Siege, which was another Costa Gavras film like Z, that was about the Tupamaros urban guerrillas kidnapping of an American diplomat in the early 1970s or late 1960s, I forget which. Anyway, they all run together over time. But the thing that struck me about all of those films, each of those films, is that each of them ends with a defeat, even a bitter defeat, right? A gross defeat. Yet each one of those films was understood by audiences to be a powerfully optimistic film. Now, we can't quite imagine that happening now, right? Films that end with bitter defeats don't give people occasion to leave the theater feeling happy if they went to the theater in the first place. But what accounts for the difference, I think, and this also may have some impact on how we think about courage, is that the moment was one in which there's a general understanding that collective action may not be successful every time, right? It may not be successful eventually, or it may not be successful on the first shot, but that eventually it makes sense to assume that, I'm trying to avoid cliches here, but that popular mobilization and concerted collective action will be successful. And whether or not that turns out to be the case in any predictable way, that was certainly the basis for a kind of collective courage, right? So, and what I would like to do, I think before I shut up, because I think I've probably said enough to get a conversation going, is I want to mention three instances that stand out to me personally of courage as a collective project. The first was like one that got me to leave college for a little while. A cafeteria worker strike at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in 1969. I mean, there were horrendous grievances that the workers had for decades, and finally, a group of supportive faculty actually paid the salary of an organizer to work with the cafeteria workers and the building and grounds workers to create a union. It was an independent union. And they fought and they won recognition, and they won, and like we were, selling, well, at that point, public institutions were so flush with money that the law school had built a new building and had moved out of the old one. And the university hadn't come up with a use for the old one yet. And it was right next to one of the cafeterias. And the workers and their student supporters moved into the abandoned law school and sold bologna sandwiches to raise money for a strike fund to keep the workers going. And just the struggle for dignity and of course for improvement of their material circumstances that the workers engaged in, and the solidarity that they displayed, and the resourcefulness and the resolve that they demonstrated were more than inspiring, right? They were a model of behavior, and it was, again, collective behavior. And it was a collective action and commitment to acting collectively that invested the effort and each of the individuals in it with courage, right? With the courage to take stands and to seek to impose their will on history, if only a little corner of history. The second is the same sort of thing, but much later. In the early 1990s in Decatur, Illinois, there was a combination of strikes and lockouts from Bridgestone Tire Company, Staley Cornstarch, and Caterpillar Tractor Corporation. And Decatur is a city of about 75 to 80,000 people. So this was about a third of the workforce of the industrial workforce of this city, who are all on strike or locked out. And I was teaching at Northwestern just outside Chicago then, and the AFL-CIO had a big national solidarity day with unions that came into town from all over the country. to march in support of striking workers. And I actually drove down. One of my undergrad advisees who was getting involved in the labor movement was her 21st birthday. So I let her ride down there with me. It's about 2 hours from, a little less than 2 hours south of Chicago. And we had to take a bus in from a staging area to the march location, and the striking and locked out workers were on the bus too. And the slogan of what was called the Decatur labor war was just one day longer. And you could see, like, the workers had been out for a long time. Things didn't look all that good for them. But again, collective commitment and pursuit of dignity, as collectively understood, kept this effort going. And it was eventually defeated, because that's what happens most of the time, right? I've often said to students who want to go into this kind of work that if you want to do it seriously, you got to approach it like a Major League Baseball player, where if you are successful 1 time out of 3, you go to the Hall of Fame, because you're going to lose a lot more than you win. The third one was much more recent, and it was like 2016, I think, 15 or 16, the Taj Mahal strike in Atlantic City, right? It was the same kind of thing. Carl Icahn, hedge fund vampire, had bought Taj Mahal, tried to void, the union contract. He bought it out of bankruptcy from Donald Trump. Tried to void the union contract, cancel health insurance and pension contributions. The workers went out. They were vehement about this. But when they decided to go out on strike, they knew the odds were against them. They knew that they were more likely to lose than they were to win, because the icon was holding all the cards. But the almost universal expression was that they weren't doing it just for themselves and for their own dignity and material security, but they also understood that if Icahn had been able to get away with taking back healthcare and pensions and cutting wages in the way that he wanted to, with impunity, like without a fight, then that would have been the beginning of the end of the regime that workers in Atlantic City had been able to win since the beginning of the 2000s. And they saw themselves as doing it, not just for themselves, but for the working population of Atlantic City across the board. So, it's funny. Like in each of those instances, right, I realized only after the fact, only after you guys had approached me to think about talking about courage, that what I experienced from the cafeteria workers at UNC in the late 1960s to the locked out workers in Decatur in the early 1990s to the Taj Mahal workers in the 2010s in Atlantic City was precisely courage as a collective project, and how people can come together through solidarity to pardon me, to create courageous action, without even being conscious of themselves as being courageous, right? And it's like, those of you who have gotten emails from me know that the first signature on my personal email is a line from the old labor songs, Solidarity Forever. And the line is, "Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one?" And that's where I think the courage comes from. So let me stop there, and if that's okay with you guys, and let's have a discussion.
Thank you very much for that lecture for us to get our discussion started. I am going to hand over the mic to Roger to moderate this discussion between all of us. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sage, and thank you, Adolph. That was really fantastic. And yes, your I love your little signature line. It's actually quite Arendtian. I mean, I assume you know that because I know you've read some Arendt, but
Right.
for her, the difference between power and violence, or power and strength, the strength is a strength of one person, and power is always collective action.
Right.
I obviously I have tons of questions, but I'd like to focus here on the students. There are two ways you can let me know you have a question. One is through the reaction button on the bottom right, which is a new button on Zoom, but I think you mostly now have it. You can raise your hand, or you can put questions in the chat. But I'd love to let you guys into the discussion. So let's see if there's some students who'd like to begin. I'll give you a minute or so to collect your thoughts. Oh, I see there. I'm sorry, there is one starting. Catalin. Yeah, go ahead.
You spoke a lot about feeling just in the moment versus not feeling it in the moment. Do you think courage is something that can be acted on if you recognize it as a feeling? Like, would it be courageous if you are aware that what you're doing it out of courage, or is it just something that you think kind of happens naturally?
Well, that's a good question. And because it's a good question, I think my first response has to be, gee, I don't know, because it is an interesting question. I mean, some people thought, for instance, that, and I'll just personalize it for a second as like the first hop on a trampoline, right? That last summer, I was like the subject of a New York Times article about an incident with a speech that I was supposed to give to a DSA chapter like in New York, and it was canceled. And I got a lot of condolences from people, right, for that, because it just seems like it's a terrible thing to have happened to you. It didn't really mean anything to me, right? I mean, like, it didn't mean anything to cancel the speech. It's kind of like, well, this is maybe one of the secrets of the trade, but like when a student kind of sleeps through an exam, right, and then comes to the professor apologetically and in a genuine way, and offers to do extra work to make up for the exam. My son, who is also a professor, is kind of cold-blooded about this, because he'll say to them, well, actually, I can appreciate your contrition, but what you're asking to do is to give me more work to do, because you're offering to do another paper. So, and the DSA thing was a little bit like that for me. I mean, because I just experienced it as, okay, well, it's one less thing to have to do, basically. With, I don't know. I mean, the way that I imagine it, it would go is more like this, right? Like, you see that there's, once you make a determination that something needs to be done, and that somebody or somebody's need to do it, then, and I could be wrong about this, but my sense is that how things are likely to happen is that you just take a deep breath and suck it up and say, okay, well, this is just something that needs to be done, right? And that you don't think about yourself as being courageous in doing the right thing. Now, that just might be my weirdness, right? I mean, it's just a matter of seeing the thing that needs to be done, and maybe trying to find ways not to do it until you face up to the fact that the only way it's going to be done will be if you do it. So in that sense, maybe courage would be, maybe the relation between courage and the action that is judged to be courageous is kind of like the relationship between the practice of science and its secondary reconstruction in the philosophy of science, so that the act may becomes courageous only after the fact. But again, like what I'm saying that is somebody who has not really thought much about courage. Does that make sense at all? Is it helpful at all? Because it can be one and not the other. So, I mean, I hope it's helpful anyway.
Maybe I can follow up Carolyn's question and your answer. You know, when people write about those folks who jump, you know, onto the subway to save someone who's fallen in as the train's coming down.
Right.
You know, the people say, I didn't think about it, I just did it. Right. And I sort of hear you sort of articulating that kind of a stance. One of the questions that those of us who've taught in the Courage to Be program have asked ourselves and are asked students for the last 6 years is, does thinking about courage make one potentially more courageous or not? Right? You know, so part, you know, look, this is a course, Sarah, but it's obviously a course. Obviously, I should say that, but it is a course that came out of conversations about, you know, how do we in some ways nurture students who are going to have the courage of their convictions, and act. Right. And you know, you sort of alluded to what happened when your speech at the DSA was canceled. I mean, you know, maybe you could tell a little bit more about it, but you know, clearly you were willing to say things that you knew would upset some people who were sometimes your friends.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering, was that hard? Was that hard? Forget the going or not, or the cancellation.
Right. Okay.
Was it hard to say that? And what were the inspirations for you in saying that?
Okay. Yeah, well, a couple of things here also. One of them is that, you know, it's, I mean, for me, it's like a guild principle, like in a way also, right? As critical intellectuals, as professors, actually, we actually have pretty soft lives, right? I mean, and the one, you know, I mean, a lot of people have softer lives. I mean, don't get me wrong, and as constantly diminishing percentage of the professoriate has, you know, anything like the soft kind of life. But the one justification, it seems to me, that we have for, and it's a moral justification, obviously, clearly nobody's imposing it, for these comparatively soft working conditions that we have, is to be honest and to think critically and to engage, and God forbid I'm quoting Popper, but in the sympathetic search for the counter instant, right? And to undermine, to apply the critical skills that we have to the world that we operate in, and to speak honestly about it. So, I mean, from that perspective, no, I mean, that just seems to me just the thing that we're supposed to be doing in the profession that we operate in. And yeah, I'm a political person. I've been a political person for as long as I've been an adult, basically, and that's sort of bound up with it too. But I mean, and look, I mean, not to be a jerk about it, but when like, people started, what I mean, to yell at me on the internet or whatever. Well, in the first place, like I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, so I don't see the vast majority of it. But cute kid, but one of the things I said to my friends was, look, what can a group of posers in Brooklyn do to me? I've been in a stockade at Fort Bragg, after all. I mean, it's not like this is anything to be. So yeah. So I don't know if that's or how adequate or effective a response that is. I hope it kind of is, but if not, tell me and I'll tease it out some more.
Well, are there other, let me invite other people to ask. I mean, the one thing I'd wonder is, have you found it to be inspiring to other people? Have people been more willing to speak their truth because of what you did, or do you not think that mattered? Was it an example for other people?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, I think the popular writing that I do, for instance, but the only reason I do it really, or at least the main one, and the reason I do podcasts and that sort of stuff, is to try to connect with people out there who are trying to think through some of these issues themselves. And the most gratifying reaction to me is like I get, at my pen on email, is comments from random people, right? Or I mean, people I don't know, thanking me for something that I've written, saying that it either helped them figure out something they were having trouble figuring out, or it helped them feel confident enough to say what they'd been thinking, but it felt cowed, right? Because of the hegemonic ideology or line, basically. And I mean, for me, that's where the academic intellectual work and the organizing work just kind of come together, right? Because I think part of the reality of where we are now in this country politically is that we're in great need of sort of small scale civic education about stuff like public good approach to government and critical thinking. And whatever the likes of us can do with the talents and the training that we have to help move each of those projects, right, within the broader public, I think that's maybe the most effective service we can perform to help to maintain or hang on to what fragile democratic institutions we have in a society at this point.
There's a question that the question just popped up from one of the people. Can you ask Adolph to expand this in the cancel culture and self-censorship, which is so problematic today? I don't know how you want to address that, but if you can.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
well, I was actually about to ask.
Oh, and then Jonah. Yeah, go ahead, Jonah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was about to ask about social media kind of activism, which kind of pertains to that question. And I guess I was just, with so much being spread and activism taking place online so much these days, I'm curious just what you think and how that pertains to courage, and whether that that can inspire courage in the same way as real life activism can, or if it can accomplish things in the same way.
That's really interesting. And a couple things again. So I imagine that you've heard the phrase beer muscles. And I sometimes talk about gun muscles, right? Like what happens with these people who just walk around having like a dirty Harry fantasy but the fantasy ends at the point where you pull the trigger and like you don't imagine what the carnage is going to be after, what the consequences are. And there's also a phenomenon that I've been calling internet muscles, because it's the same kind of thing. There's a way that the anonymity, right, or the distance, really, like you don't have to be anonymous, emboldens people like to say things they wouldn't say otherwise. I mean, the other thing I was going to note is that I just like a couple of days ago watched this new some of the new series on Netflix, a crime thing, and the first installment I think was like a 4-part or a 4 episode story about this woman named Elisa Lam, who's a young woman who in 2013 I think vanished when she was staying at a hotel next to Skid Row in LA. But what intrigued me about it was the phenomenon of these people call themselves internet sleuths, and just watching how the community forms around a constructed close attachment to a person whom you've never known, right? A conviction that that people who are in a position to have expert knowledge are by definition not to be trusted, right? Because they're corrupt or they're looking rapid to cover something up. And years ago, like I learned that a term of art in pro wrestling is kayfabe, K-A-Y-F-A-B-E. And what it means is the circumstance that all the participants, the fans, the wrestlers, the hype people, know on some level that this is fake, but they contrive to treat it as though it's real. But it's almost like a bizarre kind of right-wing populist approach, though I don't believe in right-wing populism, but a sort of faux populist appropriation of Brecht, right, where the audience makes the performance, right, and more of internet culture has struck me as being like that. And when I was watching the engagements with the internet sleuths, it reminded me for all the world of QAnon and the rest of that stuff, because it's all the same kind of thing. And the problem then is what happens when we're in a circumstance in which people will to believe that the fantasy world that they create collectively through cosplay or whatever is somehow more real than the world that the bulk of the rest of us experience as real. So I realize I'm kind of spinning away from your original question. I apologize, but I think well, I mean, just as it's less, or just as it's less of an effort, less painful to kill somebody by dropping a payload of bombs from a B-52 than it is like to strangle them to death, right? Yeah, I mean, call that courage if you want. Like, it's easier to do it. And it's easier to, in the same way, like it takes less of a personal investment to join into like an internet mob than it does, I don't know, to write a critique or to go smack somebody at a bar or whatever, right? But I think that's where you're going with the question, right? And yeah, look, as far as activism on the internet is concerned, I think that's another question. It's another issue for more serious and extensive discussion. I think there's only so far that can go, to tell you the truth. Thank you.
Jonah, do you want to add anything or not?
Yeah, well, I like that answer. Just I liked what you said on that, and I think in a certain way, it's almost the social media aspect of it and
Excuse me a
requiring
sec.
less.
Hold on, something's happened here.
Can we, is somebody playing music?
No, it was me. Sorry.
Oh,
Excuse me.
okay.
I was just saying that your response made me think of how the reason why social media kind of requires less courage to spread things or put things out there is kind of both a positive thing and a detriment when it comes to activism, but also like QAnon, as you mentioned. Those people face no consequences for what they put out there.
Right.
So it's an interesting give and take.
So I do hope some more students have a question. I have some people are sending me questions directly, so I don't know why, but you can either post them to me directly or publicly in the chat. There's a question that says, to what extent is so-called cancel culture an unforeseen consequence of the democratization of gatekeeping? That is, that social media has made everyone a publisher. I don't know.
That's also an interesting question. I mean, I think a less charitable way to look at it is that it's like given an outlet to anybody with a computer and access to the internet, and that is what it is, right? I mean, yeah, it's funny about these things. I mean, I remember in like 1971, I went to a conference on cable TV, believe it or not. And the point of the conference was how cable was going to greatly decentralize and democratize communication and life in America. And there was a lot of hype about the emancipatory potential of local access channels, and for people from big cities where there are a bunch of local access channels. We all know how that played out. But the technology. The technology is only going to further, democratizing values when it's when it's operated by people who want to support, democratizing values. So there's no such thing as a technical fix, and I think Iran would go for that too.
Yeah. I think there's a follow-up to this that just came in the chat from Carolyn, which she asked about the role of disabled activists.
Mm-hmm.
And to what extent the internet allows maybe groups to participate that might not be able or confident, or I'm just trying to think it through. Mm-hmm. As comfortable in a kind of physical public space.
Yeah, I suspect that's right. I mean, I hadn't really thought that much about it either, but it makes complete sense to me. Yeah.
I'll still look for new questions. I actually would in many ways right now we could say we're living through I don't know if you'd say this, but someone could say, I'll say provocatively, we're living through a golden age of organization. I mean, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement or Standing Rock or the Resistance, or even the Tea Party, or even the Trump folks. There's an enormous amount of political organizing, marching, protests going on. Do you see this as a golden age of organization, or is there something weirdly, even though all this is happening, it's not? I'm just wondering how you see this.
Well, that's a good question too. I mean, I'm pretty old-fashioned about that kind of stuff, right? I mean, I think I think, yeah, there's a phrase or there's a term that they use a lot in the public interest world, Astroturf, right? And there's a lot of Astroturf organizing out there as contrasted to grassroots, right? That are I would take the Tea Party, right? I mean, the Tea Party started by Dick Armey and other right-wing funders. I mean, you can almost say the same thing about Occupy, right? I mean, and Black Lives Matter. That that it's easy now to project claims to organizational capacity through the use of media, right? Right, like all it takes is to have like a Potemkin rally with like a handful of people, and then project through a charismatic voice and a mediagenic personality that you're speaking for a much larger constituency than you're actually speaking for. I think that's true on both the right and the left. So I mean, and one thing that I've noticed is that, you know, in this golden age of organization, there's a lot more of what than there is why, right? Like, I mean, what the objectives, or a lot less of what the objectives are than, or that the groups are forming for, than the sensibilities that they want to project. And branding, I think the logic of branding has a hell of a lot, I mean, to do with this. So I'm maybe not as sanguine, right, about you know, the golden age of organization, but I know that there's a lot of stuff out there for sure.
Are there some people want to jump in on this? I mean, you know, a lot of our students are people who would love to organize.
Mm-hmm.
You know, suddenly Ella Baker's in the air everywhere.
Oh yeah, she is, isn't she?
I'm just wondering, who would you, if you were to, I'm sure you've taught a course on organization or on these movements, who would you tell people to read? Who should we teach and who should they read?
Wow.
Who's your inspiration for how we can better think about organizing courageously in politics today?
Wow, that's a good question. That's a really good question. Well, somebody I was very close to was Anthony Mazzocchi, who was for a long time you know, Secretary Treasurer of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers, who as a young man, you know, just after World War II in his early 20s, he went out to work in a Helena Rubinstein local out on Long Island, right? That had never had a black member, where the Catholic Church through Cardinal Spellman was running, you know, the hiring hall, right, to keep Reds out, basically. And within 2 or 3 years, Tony was bringing bus loads of those members into Manhattan to hear Du Bois speak, and they even sort of funded like a Broadway play that bombed, didn't go anywhere, but it was like you know, Howard Fast production. And one of the points that Tony always made was that if you show people that you'll fight with them for what they want and what matters to them, then they'll pay attention to your crazy politics, right? And we'll go with it. So I mean, I think, and there are a lot of great organizers, right? I mean, like that. Oh, you know what? I'll tell you somebody, a contemporary person to read today, without question, is Jane McAlevey. She's a longtime union and housing and civil rights organizer. She did a PhD in sociology at CUNY a few years ago, and I met her when we worked together on on what started out as a wall-to-wall union organizing campaign in Stamford, Connecticut in the late 90s, and then became a housing campaign where it's the only known instance of a mobilization that successfully stopped a Hope 6 public housing displacement project, right? And that's because it was rooted like in labor. But Jane's most recent book that's out is called No Shortcuts, and I would recommend that to anybody who is interested in this kind of politics.
That's great. I don't know of her works. She's the labor organizer, so I just posted, I think, what is her website, and in the chat for people.
Okay,
who
good. Yeah, great.
And have to check that out. Are there other students who want to ask some questions? I see there's a new question in the chat again about to what extent do you think cancel culture is so readily accepted in our society as possibly attributed to the conditioning we have that punishment, such as the carceral system, is the only way to deal with certain crimes?
I think that one might be a stretch. In fact, I think cancel culture, though, we have to keep in mind, like a lot of people on the left claim that there's no such thing as cancel culture, but frankly, I've always been inclined to associate it more with the self-righteousness of the particularly entitled, right? I mean, not carceralization, right? I mean, I mentioned in my opening comments that I was a child of the McCarthy era, and like I read The Crucible pretty early in life, and so much of what goes on, under the guise of ideological purification, within the movement, just smacks of uninformed witch hunting to me, and it feels good to people. It feels good to people to do it, and I don't quite understand why it feels so good to the people to whom it feels good, but it clearly feels good to them, and I think it's partly because like they don't read the script into the end, right? Because the priest winds up getting undone by the mob also, right? I mean, but yeah, and that's an interesting question, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. I think the roots of cancel culture come from exactly the opposite end of things, from a sense of self-righteousness and entitlement. And shouldn't forget the third point of the Triple Crown: lazy-mindedness, and the combination of self-righteousness and entitlement and lazy-mindedness is a hell of a combo.
I
You wouldn't know about that at Bard, of course.
No, there's no lazy-mindedness at Bard,
right?
Or entitlement. I just got a long question that was sent in a direct message. I haven't read it all the way through, but let me see what I can do with it.
Okay.
It says, what does courage look like today for someone who believes that we live in a time of, say, the intersection of hypocrisy, iconoclasm, and fierce moralism? A manifestation of this is woke politics and identity politics. If the status quo demands we all conform to identity politics rhetoric, do you think courage to dissent may be in the hands of a few to rile people to come out of the shadows? Say, for example, to play into their language dissent from a non-white dude, it says. Is courage through dissent by an individual helpful today in today's world? And that courage can't come from anonymity. I think it goes on a bit, but I think that's the fundamentals of it.
Yeah, well, that's also interesting. That sounds a little bit to me like my good friend and comrade Cornel West, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, well, we certainly have to dissent from this stuff, but I think one of the things that people on the left don't do often enough is to, and even those who understand themselves to be some kind of Marxists or whatever, is apply the logic of the political economic thinking to the left itself, right? A good friend of mine mentioned to me like a couple of weeks ago that it's possible now that one could have like a successful 40-year career and retire with a good pension from a union or a public interest group, but by just doing the same thing, right? Like by taking, just as one instance, a progressive bill in Congress that doesn't make it out of committee, doesn't make it to the floor, and then the new Congress comes around, and the task then is a struggle for the revision of the bill, and then set the target of the number of signers that you want to get on the bill, which should be at least as many as there were in the last version, and then do all of the inside baseball stuff that you need to do to try to get that number of signers. And then if you do, the clock runs out again. There's another new Congress, and you rinse and repeat. And this could go on for 40 years without producing anything. And you could preserve, the noble sense of yourself as an activist, and retire with a nice pension, without having had any impact on anything. Another, maybe in some ways more corrosive expression of the political economy of activist politics or whatever is, I mentioned branding, right? Everybody with a podcast or a column is on some level like an entrepreneur, and they've got a product that they're trying to sell, and part of the sales job is product differentiation, and that introduces a bombastic disposition as well as a hyperbolically competitive disposition into a project that should be, or I would think, should be about trying to build solidarities and broaden them, like instead of going the other way around. And it's the same thing. Like I'll say this about the identity politics thing too. Like I've been asking the same question for more than 30 years now, which is that how are we to understand how it's possible to build the solidarities that you need to have the kind of movement that you need to change the policy direction in the country, if we have to begin by going around the room to establish not what we have in common, but how we all differ and what we don't have in common. And I've never gotten a decent answer to that. But that's also, connected with the NGOization of these movements, right? All right, so I've forgotten what the original question is now. I think I may have responded to it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you have. I think the question is how to respond to identity politics and woke politics.
Yeah.
So,
well, look, it's like this. I think the way to respond to it is by asking how it helps us get to where it is we're trying to get to, and then that forces a discussion of where we're trying to get to. And it turns out we're probably not all trying to get to the same place. I just read through chunks of Sandy Darity and Corinne, I think her first name is, Mullen's book on the reparations, and it turns out that a lot of what their focus is on is as a project helping rich Black people become as rich as their rich white counterparts, and that's a political project that's as legitimate as any other, I guess. It's just not one that I have any interest in. But so it's good for us to know, right? Because you can't just assume that you can't read out politics, one's a political orientation from what's on the birth certificate or the identities that one claims. So it's good to have the substantive discussions.
Great. We probably have time for one or two more questions if there are people.
Yeah, I should say, look, I'm here, but I can go over if you want. I'm here as long as you want me. So,
Okay. Is there anyone else wants to ask a last question?
I actually do have a question
Okay.
regarding how we were speaking about the golden age earlier of like organization and everything. I'm wondering, in your opinion, if you think after seeing like what has occurred in the past couple of years, if you see us actually getting somewhere, because I feel like in some cases, like you said, like there are times where it's a lot of struggle and you lose more than you get out of it sometimes. But I'm wondering, in your personal opinion, from what you've seen in the past year, do you see us actually going somewhere with it and us actually making achievements or like progression?
Well, yeah, that's a great question too. I've got it. So, I know that people tend to think that I'm not a very optimistic person, that I'm always like a yes, but when you consider that I've been trying to do the same walk or move in the same direction now, like for half a century, so I got to be somewhat of an optimistic person. I think this is a really dicey, well, I won't be coy. I think this is a very dangerous moment, like in American politics, right? I think, the right, like just in the past, since the 6th of January, even, and I wasn't surprised that happened, right? It's what Trump and his and that element of his base have been telling us was going to happen for a long time. One of the things that we have going for us, or we had going for us, is that Trump is closer to Lonesome Rhodes from a face in the crowd than to Hitler. Like he's the game show host version of Hitler, basically. But I think that it's become clearer in the past couple of weeks. It's become clearer, even maybe since the since the conclusion of the impeachment trial, that there are there are well-funded political forces and tendencies in American politics that not only don't have a commitment to democratic institutions, but are actively and antagonistic to them. And I've been joking with a Brazilian friend of mine lately that, our Junkers, or the American equivalent of a Junker stratum of the upper class is, it looks like they're in a position to give Bolsonaro in Brazil a run for his money, right? As to who can, as to which group will be able completely, like, to undermine, democratic institutions first. So yeah, I think it's a dangerous time, and I don't know. For quite a while in this country, the right has had a better sense about how to organize than the so-called left has had. So, it's.
Can you say more about that? Why do you say that?
Well, I say that because, the obvious reasons are that the right has had more in the way of resources, right? There's big money, corporate media, right, and that, but they also understand, right? There's the Goldwater story, right? Like what happened after Goldwater's defeat was the ultra right recognized that they made their move too soon. Spent the next 16 years basically trying to organize in the underground, right? At school board elections, right, and whatever, field testing the kind of message that they could cohere and electoral coalition around. And you remember, a handful of us who can recall the 80s, right, and can recall that a lot of pundits' wisdom was about how the Republican coalition was intrinsically unstable because it was made up of right-wing social conservatives and what were basically libertarian rich people. But part of the coalitional work was producing the kind of tight political alliance such that people who didn't care about abortion would support anti-abortion candidates because they knew that the anti-abortion candidates would also vote for tax cuts, and vice versa. And there hasn't been anything like that on the left. There hasn't been any effort to build that kind of alliance on the left. There are a lot of reasons for it, some of which have to do with the nature of the Democratic coalition too. But ultimately, I think it's because the right has pretty much known where they want to go, the kind of society that they want to create or produce. And there's not been anything like that kind of coherent vision that's animated left center politics. I mean, for people who are interested in this, a kind of interesting book by Russell Jacoby came out at the end of the 90s called it's called End of Utopia, and he makes the point that the left, once the left in the U.S. severed its commitment to a transformative vision, to a vision simply that the society could be qualitatively better than it currently is, then there was no place for it to go. And the liberals then also lost their moorings. And identity politics, or what's called identity politics now, has come to fill the void of a left program. So we got nothing like to offer the majority of the working people in the country who are suffering, and what we have to offer them is moral hectoring, which then just makes it easier for the right to recruit them. So,
Kiara, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think I'm shifting the conversation a little bit in a different direction, trying to articulate something I've been thinking about throughout, which is the question is, what in your experiences is the other or the opposite of courage, right? So it would be traditionally thought of as fear. And one of the texts that we're all reading in the Courage to Be class, Paul Tillich describes it as anxiety, overcoming the anxiety of meaninglessness. And there's a really popular strand in culture today where Brene Brown talks about courage always involves vulnerability. So that's the opposite of courage that also comes along with courage. But so I'm asking, what is it in ourselves that we have to overcome when we are engaging in an act of courage?
That's a good question too. I mean, that was a great question. And I mean, it really is the case. I mean, it's unfortunate that it is, but it really is the case that I'm just not somebody who's thought about courage a lot. But as I said, I've thought about absence of courage more than I've thought about courage. So I can try to articulate that. Well, all right. So I mean, here's what may sound like an odd kind of anecdote, but when Clarence Thomas was nominated to the Supreme Court, like I just moved to Chicago from the East Coast and was scuffling to try to get my cable connected so that I could watch the hearings. Okay. And at the beginning of the hearings, Strom Thurmond, who was Thomas's patron, basically, or one of them, kind of laid out the softball question to Thomas that was dripping with patronizing, right? It could not have been worse. And Clarence Thomas is my age. He grew up right on the South Carolina border, close in Georgia, close to Savannah. So there's no question that he knew what Strom Thurmond had been since Strom Thurmond's name was Ben Tillman, right? So I watched as the camera panned, closely, or a real tight shot on Thomas. And I've said this to friends, but to friends afterward, that I thought that was the moment when any self-respecting Black person, especially a self-respecting Black person with Clarence Thomas's profile, would just take the microphone off and back away from the table and say something like, "Gee, white folks, I really thought I wanted this job, but this would just do goddamn much to do." But he did not bat an eyelash, right? So I guess we could say that that's the opposite of courage, or we could say from his perspective, it's probably courage, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a tough question, and I'm not trying to skirt it. I mean, because it's something that we all have to deal with all of the time. I mean, yeah, I mean, I spent like most of my youth, like off in the corner someplace trying to examine my conscience, right? And the problem with it, of course, is that the more precocious you are, the easier it is to lie to yourself. And the more precocious you are, the more likely you are to know that it's easy to lie to yourself. So it's like an endless downward spiral. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I really have never felt especially courageous, or I've never felt that I've done anything that's especially courageous. I've done some things that other people think of as courageous, but like for me, it's just always been a matter of doing the thing you're supposed to do, doing what's the right thing, or trying to do what's the right thing. And it's true, like my father's dictum that no one ever really does anything from malign motives, right? Like but he always said that he thought that the sincerity was vastly overvalued as a virtue, right? Because everybody is ultimately sincere, at least to themselves. So what do you do with that? I don't know. I mean, people, I mean, take the Judenrat, for instance. I mean, just as one kind of illustration. So what do you do with that, right? I mean, people who are convinced, who were convinced, who convinced themselves that they were making a great sacrifice, trying to keep themselves alive to help keep others alive while sacrificing others. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, yeah, it's tough. Yeah, it's just tough. I don't know. I mean, now, I mean, it's easy. Like some cases are easy. Like, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union and communists from all over the country rushed, to sign up to go to the front. Well, that's a kind of courageous act, right? Or it's kind of a commitment. What was it? Fanatical? Was it some way coerced? I don't know. Yeah. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm not being helpful at all about this.
Actually, I found it very helpful. I think what I would synthesize from what you were saying is one aspect of the other of courage is conformity. And so what Clarence Thomas did was a kind of endurance of and so courage in that sense, but not courageous in the sense of conforming to what was expected in that situation. And it seems to me that what I know of your acts of courage, speaking out on transraciality and identity politics, are similar in breaking the conformist mold. So I did find it helpful.
Okay, well, good. Thank you. I'm glad to be of help.
I think we're going to have one last question from Professor Franco Baldasso. Franco.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for this very, very interesting talk. And I'm so glad to see all the students attentively listening to this amazing, to these very interesting topics. I'd like to go back to the beginning of your lecture. And in the meantime, you said that we need a small scale civic education. And I think it's a thought that everybody can agree on it. But you started your lecture mentioning two films. One is Organizer, and the title, the original title would be better translated as Comrades, which is like a plural title, not The Organizer, which is very interesting. And the Battle of Algiers. There are two amazing films that they talk about resisting capital, but also resisting colonization. And as you pointed out, they end in a defeat. I mean, we can talk a lot about how the myth of the beautiful loser is also part of our culture.
Right.
But I'm very, very interested in what you said after that. Back then, people, when they were watching this film, they ended up in a defeat. Were going outside the movie theater, galvanized. And I just would like to know more about that, to hear your comments, why that is maybe not the case anymore, or maybe it can still be the case.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I know. I mean, I was struck by it. And I mean, the difference only occurred to me, like I said, when I watched that, this glut of those older films, like in one day, because they all end in pretty crushing defeat. But especially those from the mid '60s forward, there was just an understanding. Pardon me? Oh, I'm sorry. But there was just an understanding that defeat was the prelude to ultimate victory, right? And for people who, for a moment in the culture when the audiences for films like that were people who understood themselves to be more or less organically connected to those movements, there was something that was inspiring about them, especially if you're experiencing your own defeat, right? Now, I think a difference is that the idea of protracted struggle or close and tightly woven organizing efforts that are pointed, to some point down the road, is kind of lost from the activist culture, right? Just as it's another kind of snarky sort of illustration. I just had an email exchange with a grad student and a couple of local union leaders, putting people in touch with one another. And I forwarded it to a friend of mine and said, so if this exchange and this project of putting people like in touch with one another in pursuit of some objective is what the young people would understand to be an instance of organizing, if it included like a bullhorn and a placard, because what's happened now is the protest or the act of protest has kind of displaced the slow and protracted understanding of the struggle, and the idea of commitment to a transformative ideal that's going to take longer than an election cycle to win, right? Even though like the reform objectives that seem winnable within an election cycle aren't really winnable within an election cycle either. Just seems like old-fashioned or unthinkable. So, and look, some of it is just a function of age. I remember the first time that my son saw the Battle of Algiers as an adult. I made him watch it as a kid once or twice. When he was in college, he said, "Wow, this is an uplifting film. Look at the end." But since then, as he's watched it as a full adult and is like embedded in trade union politics himself, and and has more of an historian's historicist understanding of what movements are, right? I mean, he can see the point too, but I do think, yeah, I mean, I'll come completely clean. I do think it says something about the different character of the time, and the fact that that approach, that approach to politics, especially to left politics, that's tied to pursuit of a transformative vision, and where the politics is all about trying to craft strategic approaches that can help pursue this transformative vision over time is like all but lost. And I think that's a big difference, right? You want, but at this point, and like this would be like the snarky old man's comment, but at this point, like you want the Avengers to come in, right? Or whatever like group of superheroes are to come in and to vanquish the bad guy. And then you have like, the ideal world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adolph. And I'd like everyone to thank Adolph for a really stimulating talk today.
Well, thanks. It's my pleasure. I hope it's what you guys had in mind. I hope it's helpful, and thanks again for asking me. I appreciate it very much.
Very much. And thanks, Sage, and everyone else, the Courage to Be team, for organizing it. Our next talk is with Steven Zeidman, and it will be March 10th. So I look forward to seeing you all back again then. Thank you all very much, and see you soon.